And the working title for my thesis is Defining and Identifying Success, a comparative case study of internally displaced people, camps, and behavior. So I'm just going to start today by giving a brief introduction to the context, go into my thesis question, really dissect that a little bit, talk a bit about the significance, sorry, I shouldn't say that, of this research, go through my proposed methodology, and leave time for questions, both for myself, questions that I'm still working through, and also a time for us to discuss together. So the overarching goal of my thesis is really to present an opportunity for improvement, to provide feedback on the initial humanitarian response after a natural disaster. And I'm really looking at incorporating long-term planning into the immediate response. And so just taking a look at natural disasters, this is the number of people that were displaced by natural disasters in 2011. And from 2008 to 2011, anywhere from 15 million to 40 million people were displaced by natural disasters. So this is kind of such a large portion of the population. It really is kind of growing this year. In addition, there's the issue of protracted displacement. That in the 1990s, the average length of displacement for refugees and IDPs was 9 years, and now that average is approaching 20 years. And this kind of really becomes an issue because in the immediate humanitarian response, the framework for deploying a camp or deploying settlement really is a temporary 1 to 2 year framework for that, and kind of what happens when the whole basis of that initial deployment kind of is extended longer and longer. So this is the same as kind of this chart too, and I want to see. But kind of am trying to work through the flows of the different inputs, cultural inputs, environmental, economics, and political, that lead up to a disaster, and looking at the deployment of the humanitarian response. And where I'm focusing for my thesis is in the planned and managed camp, focusing on internal displacement as opposed to international refugees. And looking at kind of what happens after that camp is deployed. And right now I've kind of categorized this into five longer-term results of a camp. The first one is that what I've kind of called perpetual temporality, where the camp kind of life is extended, and the people that are living in the camp don't really know. They don't have a permanent, durable settlement, but they're not really sure kind of what's happening next. The second one I've called a transition to permanence, a figurative or literal paving of the roads of the camp, where permanent housing is built, where the initial camp is deployed, and people are moved from a tent to a permanent camp. The last three are result in an official termination of the camp, and these are repatriation, where the population is moved back to their original home, resettlement, where they're resettled in a different location other than either the camp or their original home, and local integration, where they're locally integrated into the place where they were initially displaced. And so where my thesis really is kind of in working in evaluation of what happens here, and kind of how can that feed back into the initial humanitarian response. So the question is, what are the elements of successful IDP camps that can be applied in settlement-based humanitarian aid situations? And so kind of want to just dissect this a little bit and work it out. The first major question is, what do you mean by success? What's a successful IDP camp? And so my thesis actually kind of, and picturing it in taking two parts. The first is really wrestling with what do we mean by success, and kind of how to create categories of camps that have been successful. And right now, the working overarching definition for that are camps that have transitioned from being a temporary settlement solution to being a durable and sustainable settlement solution. And so this will include social resilience, education, access to services. And I'm still working through kind of what that means. IDPs are internally displaced persons or people. I'm focusing on the formal and planned camp. And I wanted to really make sure to include applied here, because I really want this to be a report that's targeted to an audience of people that are working in the humanitarian aid response and come up with actionable lessons learned that are generalizable for similar situations. Settlement-based, kind of working in this through the lens of urban planning, kind of looking at the physical manifestation of the humanitarian aid and how it takes that form through settlement patterns. And humanitarian aid really speaking to kind of the goods and services that are provided in response to a humanitarian crisis, where the needs and response to the crisis kind of overwhelm the existing capabilities and capacity to respond to those needs. And so the theoretical framework kind of that I'm actually pursuing just at the GSC, but also that guide this thesis, are questions about what's the role of temporality in urban planning? How do you create space for something that's ephemeral, that's not going to last? What's the role of urban planning in humanitarian aid? And kind of what's the intersection between public health and urban planning, both in the long-term recovery and development process, as well as the immediate response? So just want to spend a little bit of time, again, why I'm focusing on the formal and planned camp. As I touched upon before, being the tension between it being deployed as a temporary framework and then kind of it lasting longer. And then also these statistics come from a study that was done in Haiti that compares affected populations that live in a camp or outside of a camp, and in a camp are the blue shaded colors. And you can see in a camp kind of a large majority of the services are actually provided in a camp, so food assistance, water, healthcare, psychological assistance. However, life in a camp, people are much more likely to report high levels of psychological stress. They're more likely to report insecurity or security problems and theft, and they're less likely to have wealth indicators, so less likely to be able to live on more than $1.25 a day. And so my thesis, like I mentioned before, kind of has two major parts. The first one is defining success, and the methodology for this section will really be looking at previous evaluations of NGOs or other organizations that are evaluated kind of how that camp has done, and compiling, contradicting, supporting, and coming up with an idea of what do we mean by having a successful IDP camp. And the second part, first, will be is the comparative case study. And the first part is cataloging IDP camps, so just gathering data on camps that were deployed in Haiti, when they were deployed, how many people they served, demographics, whether or not it's closed, kind of the current situation. And then using the definition that we created in the first part to identify these successful case studies. And this part I'm also still really kind of working through. And then after identifying those case studies, identifying an evaluation framework in order to compare the different case studies and also to extract an actionable item or lessons learned. And so most of my data sources, a large majority of them come from NGO, other profit or nonprofit papers or evaluations and reports. I'm looking at, there are additionally some academic institution papers as well. I'm planning on conducting some interviews with institutional actors, so people that are deploying these camps and are working, and as well as news reports and articles and the perception of what's happening. Just have a time frame for when I expect and hope to do all these things. I'm guessing. Kind of in defining success, identifying case studies, and mapping, and kind of when I propose to have all this done. This is an image of IDP camps in Port-au-Prince, and I'm working on getting actually the raw data for this image. But this just starts to kind of introduce the question that I'll have on the next sleeve of what aspects kind of I'm going to use to pick the case study, whether or not I'm going to pick actually a camp in Port-au-Prince or one that's a little further out, kind of one that's in the city or more towards a less developed area, and kind of working out different issues of size and location and relationship. And just some of the questions that I'm just continuing to move through are how to define that success and what are the appropriate factors to use in identifying the case studies. And like I said before, kind of the overarching goal is to really be able to provide lessons learned and feedback that influence and affect the initial humanitarian response.
Any questions? Anybody want to start?
I have kind of a very basic question. When you say, so I don't know how you phrase it, but when you said like the permanent solution, are you talking about permanently making that camp or permanently resettling the people, or is that clear?
Is your question kind of one of these five when I was talking about?
Because you said when you were defining success, it was like this problem has been solved. Does that mean that the camp has been made permanent, or does that mean that the people have been, or is that one of your questions moving forward?
There was some turn of phrase that was a little confusing.
Okay.
What was it though? It was something
Was
that
it
made me
transition
think.
to permanence?
It was something that made me think when you said, "Oh, you're talking about the camp, like you're looking at when these camps become permanent, or something like that." And I'm like, "Oh."
Also the people.
Yes,
I got confused about what you meant by that, and maybe that's just a clarification.
What I think, well,
It's your flow chart.
yeah, this is a little, kind of in what happens to the camp. So the 5 cases I said were perpetual, temporality, transition to permanence, repatriation, resettlement, and local integration. The transition to permanence, which is, I'm not sure if this is the one that you're talking about, Lisa, is examples of camps that kind of have on part of their land built like tents and housing, or like the temporary tents and tarpons, and then as they're developing, they build a permanent, what they expect to be permanent housing, kind of in the same camp area, and then transition the people living into tents into living in permanent housing.
I think the question was more when you were wrestling with what defines success. It wasn't clear whether this was this is what you're going for, or you have no attitude as yet. Kind of which of these is the
Okay. I'm still right now. I'm thinking these 4. In my mind, I think are durable solutions, and there are, I think, different aspects. Like even though a population may be locally integrated, it still may not be a durable solution where they're in places of high risk or living in maybe a potentially unsafe and violent neighborhood or in a situation that's less stable than what they were before. So even within these categories, there are cases that I wouldn't call successful. So I'm still working kind of within that. What does that mean? If you're locally integrated, how can that be successful or not successful?
All right, sorry.
Go ahead.
Also, you mentioned long-term recovery, which is not very well defined. So I would encourage you to think, okay, and/or scale, just like you did your timeline, where long-term can be, and then how different decisions have been made on that perpetual temporary, right? Because most IDP camps aren't going to admit that they're perpetual temporary anyways. So when you do that, and at least you could propose it, because it's absent from the field as far as I've seen. So it gives you an opportunity to propose something, then let someone argue against you, which would be fine. But is it a year, 2 years, 4.5 years, 9 years? When do we start saying that that's not temporary anymore?
How would you address those kinds of, I think, actually key and probably some of the most interesting questions you have about this vague and temporal nature or permanent temporal nature of some of these things with case studies in Haiti, where probably we haven't been long enough, right? If you're talking specifically, I mean, there are probably like camps and further, but talking specifically related temporary refugee camps, like how will you know what the end conditions are?
That is a really good question. There are, and that's also something still that I'm looking at. There are some previously due to kind of smaller earthquakes in the past as well as hurricanes that come through, there are displaced camps that are longer than the 2.5 years ago when the earthquake happened. But what I think, what I'm leaning towards looking at are camps that have already closed, kind of from either from here or previously, as an example of a case study of a camp that's already closed.
Because one thing which would be a little tricky is if you find like a good case study and it's a camp that closed for 2 years. I mean, it might tell you a lot about the specific organization of that camp that arguably, I guess, maybe the successful camp house people closed image. But it's not going to tell you very much about more long-term possibilities.
Regina, first, I thought this was really a great presentation, which is, you have a very good research question. You outlined it very clearly, and you have sort of already roadmapped the project, which is fantastic. And, we can't sort of ask you our standard, like, what's your case study kind of question. And you have a really good question, obviously with great urgency and stuff. So just, wanted to make sure you realize kind of that you're in a good position already. My question, I guess, is in terms of your sort of role as a planner, are you thinking that you'll approach this largely through policy recommendations or through spatial, or of course it could be both, but do you have a sense for sort of the kinds of, you call them best practices that you're looking for?
I think I'm seeing it as a combination of both spatial and policy, in terms of kind of in discussing this with some people, trying to think about the unique aspects of an evaluation that I can bring as an urban planner to this, and so I think it would be remiss to leave out the spatial analysis, but definitely kind of how that relates with the policy implementation is something that I'm hoping to do.
Another question I have, so you'll have a host of case studies that will be of different sizes and locations. I guess my question is, at the end of the day, do you anticipate, and this is a little bit of a loaded question perhaps, but or I feel like I know the answer, so maybe it's not fair to ask, but I guess my question is, there's probably not one camp that is successful, but if you, or maybe there is, and then okay, your job is done, but I would imagine that in looking at the case studies, it's going to be more of a sort of a la carte, this aspect of this one seems like it was successful, and this, so are you anticipating that kind of work, where you're the sort of sifter and then sort of elicitor and compiler? Okay.
Other than just saying yes to that answer, I'm thinking about it kind of in like the frontier, in previous research that's done, kind of when they're looking at camps and evaluating it. The evaluations kind of take the form of how did our food program, how many women, children, disabled did it serve, or how many people did we move into this type of situation, and what the percentage of that. And so kind of the take on that I haven't seen, that I would like to do with this thesis, is why were this percent of people able to move into a durable solution, where this percent weren't, and kind of the why question of kind of how that happens is what I'm looking at.
Well, I'd recommend Robert Putnam's work, who's here as well, on the social capital. So on your social problems, I would be curious in the reports if any are designing the placement of tents or products to the benefit of community and building community, because community is so pivotal in actually the capacity building of the community, refugee or survivor in this case themselves. So I would see, usually IDP camps, from my limited experience, they look a lot alike. And so is anyone looking at the redesign of actually how to place it? And another thing I consider is anyone looking at, they're not, but if you find them, let me know. But is anyone looking at using products for temporary housing that are more likely to be used for permanent solutions? Because everybody wants to do tarps and whatnot, but you can print solar on the back of plastic or something that could actually be used later to build. And as we've seen in the NGOs, the success of sending tents by the buckets if they're needed, or the box, tents in the box, right? Rotarians is great. Is there anyone solving something that actually could address that this has to be more permanent or built up into more permanent, right? Your 4x8 could end up at 8x20 if reassembled, type thing, and probably at a lower cost.
I was going to say a very similar thing, that one of your entries in as a designer is the materials that are used, and their long-term durability, or their reuse. And in this case, as local as possible. There's a lot, I suppose it's also destroyed, and a lot in terms of reuse, I would imagine. And then another evaluating factor could be the location. When you're doing these case studies, it's the urban fabric that does remain, or that is being rebuilt. In other words, the adjacencies to the camp. Does that in any way influence the success of the camp itself? So that locating the camp is as important as the size or spread, or other parameters that you can imagine. And as an urban planner, those two elements are really key to your methodology for unlocking reasons for choosing certain case studies, I would imagine. I also agree. It's a very exciting thesis, frankly. I mean, I'd like to see it again. I'd like to see where you take it. I'd like to be in the movie forward.
We're all invited to the thesis review, the final one is in May.
I would flag a couple of things. One is, I do agree this is like incredibly well organized and laid out. It seems to be very quantitative, the way that you're thinking about metrics of success, for instance, about numbers of percentage of people who are done this and done that. And I would, it's hard to say, like, I don't want to see the disaster aspect of this, but let's not, like, how would you address, how do you get at some of the more qualitative aspects of post-disaster management and planning, no matter what? Like, what are the challenges? I mean, you listed out like water sanitation, hygiene, those are just words, right? Like, it doesn't, I don't know if you've had a chance to, like, on the ground there, or spoken to people who have come back from, like, spending 6 months there. Like, what are just some of the, like, very unique challenges of this kind of landscape that we're dealing with? And in Haiti, it's not just a hardship of people living in the camps, although that is like clearly some of the things we're looking at. But it's also this like kind of like crazy securitized like NGO, like super NGO landscape, where everything is more complicated than perhaps it necessarily needs to be. And how do you address maybe some of like the social and emotional aspects of living, working, and just like operating within this kind of environment?
Are you going to speak to people on the camps, or are you just going to go in and do a case study? And to what extent can you map those qualitative ideas that occur?
Those are really good.
For instance, I want to say, when I read an article that I thought was really fascinating. I don't find reference to it for too long, but I have to rack my brain for a long time ago. It was after the Japanese tsunami. And when interviewed, people wanted music first. The dead silence was one of the most. Did you read the same article? It was like one of the most painful things to face was how quiet it was. I don't think that anyone could have guessed that hadn't been through a disaster could ever come up with that asset. And so really speaking to people about what makes the camp successful is I think each case study has to have a case study person with it. Oh, was it? Yeah. But it was part of an article
Times. I saw that too.
We're reading so much in that time, right?
Yeah,
Well, if I may, I don't know how much more time we have, maybe 5 minutes.
Exactly.
There's a great, clear presentation, and Regina's kind of been moving, from the definition of success as really being these three to being broader, to incorporating this transition of permanence. And I think if I can summarize some of the comments, Ethan's and yours really touched on like certain aspects that you've been grappling with for some time, like is it an internal characteristic that leads to permanence, materials, adjacency, the people in there, or is it this external, is it the government, is it the social context, is it the situation they're in? And so maybe that's like, an irresistible conflict that needs to be fleshed out, but I think I've heard that from 3 or 4 people here to try to grapple with that definition a little more of success. And, I think certainly there may be more examples of this that you find, in Haiti than these three. I'm not really sure. You have found one case study that was successful. So in terms of everybody moving out of a camp into a permanent home, everybody actually leaving the camp situations. So we have that to work with. And I think a crucial struggle is how do you pick any remaining case study?
One quick, just to follow on to Rosetta's point in yours too, you should, as a good planner and a person in the same building as geographers increasingly, you should think in terms of scale also, because I think what maybe Rosetta was partly saying, and I agree, is that in sort of looking, telescopically, you'll find that success is different at different scales, and so, you will want to pay attention to the kind of individual level scale as well as, say, the national scale or the international scale, and by those sort of moves, you'll probably find different levels of success and different definitions of success too, and that might allow you to sort of make some broader conclusions as well, instead of just about a single sort of camp as a subsistent, singular place.
Yeah, I think I would note on it, if it fits in, but I would note also those things that didn't work, that then the population was blamed for. I mean, for example, I saw villages rebuilt, but they weren't rebuilt in context for Haiti, so no one was living in houses, and then people blamed the Haitians for that. And also recognizing that sometimes we saw in some camps, the camp, because they had water, sewer, food, and those things that you listed so well, there's an influx in them from the rural sides. So what happens when the camp has benefits that the outside community doesn't? How do we balance that? And then finally, for this section of comments, I would also, in your timeline, is to say, when do you spark like an architectural effect and or a social effect, whether it be music and or a school? You have great programs, architecture for humanity and whatnot, that go into schools. How do you get a school so that you can draw people out from where they actually have services and create new services? And how far can you draw them out as people are being drawn into the city? They're not going to move 4 hours away, but they might move, 4 miles away if they can still get there on the busing system.
It would be really interesting if somehow your final planning was more like a timeline of operations that kind of was able to shift and allow for different scenarios and had along its way different thresholds of being able to also address the idea of monitoring and evaluating as you go along. Because clearly you have to come in after to do that kind of monitoring, and then you're learning from lessons that are often deployed too late. And so even just integrating the idea of monitoring into rebuilding is kind of interesting. Great. Any other questions?
So success, I can do this all day. But I think a fun thing of success might be is, if you could get your original used products to be used in a final product, I think that would be a tremendously powerful point of success. Almost like a cradle to grave type thing, a cradle to cradle, if you will, but from the point of coming into country to being used for permanent housing, if those were your 2 cradle points, for lack of a better term. I'm not a designer or a planner. But I think that would be a tremendous, a powerful statement of success to people who are sending stuff. Is to say, essentially is that instead of just sending tents, if you were sending a product that then could be used in their permanent housing solution, I think that'd be amazing, because we see the tents wear away and the tarps all over the place, and why not send something that could actually be used to rebuild a permanent home?
Should be able to look at that question.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no doubt you could get the partnerships in there, and there's funding that could be moved for it. It's just a matter of no one's going to own it alone,
Right.
and so you have to get someone to try it a few times.
Yeah. And there's no shortage of disasters, so you probably have the chance to try it a
Yeah,
few times.
fortunately, right?
Unfortunately. So do you have any comments that you want to make there?
No, I don't. Thank you guys so much.
That's great.
Yeah.